On December 20th, 1944, the 1st SS Panzer Division crossed the Allied line with more than 200 tanks and thousands of soldiers. Their objective: to take Bastogne, cut the road to Arlon, and open a path to the Meuse. It was the core of Hitler's last major attack on the Western Front. They advanced in columns over icy roads, crushing inexperienced divisions. The offensive took the Allied High Command by surprise. Within hours, entire villages were under German control. Patton's Third Army turned 90 degrees in the dead of winter and marched 150 kilometers through snow to confront them. At Lutrebois, Longvilly and Remoifosse, a direct clash began between the Reich's best tanks and America's most lethal mobile machinery. Who had the real advantage in that duel? What stopped Hitler's elite when they seemed unstoppable? And why did this battle mark the beginning of the end? Hitler's last move, the Reich on the brink. As the winter of 1944 covered Europe with its white blanket, the Third Reich found itself in a desperate situation. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly toward Prussia. In the West, after the disastrous Normandy campaign and the liberation of France, the Allies were approaching the German border. For Germany, the war seemed irretrievably lost. Adolf Hitler, isolated in his bunker and increasingly disconnected from military reality, conceived a bold plan that would change the course of events on the Western Front. The Ardennes offensive, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, represented the Führer's last chance to avoid defeat. The objective was ambitious but clear: launch a massive surprise attack through the dense forests of the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, capture the strategic port of Antwerp, and force the West to negotiate a separate peace. The choice of terrain was no coincidence. The Ardennes, with its dense forests, deep valleys, and few passable roads, seemed unsuitable for the deployment of large armored units. Precisely for this reason, the Allies had assigned inexperienced or exhausted divisions to this region to recover from combat. The winter weather conditions, snow, persistent fog, and sub-zero temperatures, perfectly complemented the German plan by neutralizing the Allied air superiority, which had been decisive in the preceding months. For this desperate operation, Hitler assembled the best remaining German war machine. The core of this force was the 6th SS Panzer Army, under the command of Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, which included 2 armored corps and 4 SS Panzer Divisions. Among them was the Reich's most notorious unit, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Initially created as Hitler's personal guard, the Leibstandarte had evolved into a formidable fighting machine. Its men, selected according to strict physical and ideological criteria, had fought on every European front: Poland, France, the Balkans, Russia, and Normandy. The unit's reputation was based on a combination of ideological fanaticism, superior training, and top-of-the-line equipment. However, the division preparing for the offensive was no longer the same one that had rampaged through Europe years before. The intense losses suffered in Normandy had forced its ranks to be replenished with hastily trained young recruits and veterans recovered from wounds. Despite this, it remained one of the most lethal units available, equipped with Tiger the Kunu and Panther tanks and the devastating Jagdpanther tank destroyers. The plan assigned the 1st SS the mission of quickly breaking through the American lines, advancing to the Meuse River and continuing toward Antwerp. To execute this mission, the division was organized into Kampfgruppen, battle groups, featuring Kampfgruppe Piper and Kampfgruppe Hansen, each with an optimized mix of tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance units. On the Allied side, the attack took the High Command by surprise. When the offensive began on December 16th, the American forces in the area were primarily inexperienced divisions or veteran units sent there to recover. The speed of the initial German advance caused confusion and panic in some quarters, threatening to escalate into a 1940-style debacle. However, the Allied reaction was swift and decisive. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. Among his first measures was the dispatch of reinforcements to the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a crucial communications hub where 7 major roads converged. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement throughout the region. Allied side's most controversial and effective generals entered the scene. George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the U.S. Third Army. While other generals were still assessing the situation, Patton was already on the move. At a meeting at Verdun on December 19th, he offered something that seemed impossible: to turn the axis of advance of 3 entire divisions 90 degrees in the middle of winter and counterattack in a matter of days. Patton's Third Army was no ordinary force. Hardened by campaigns in Africa, Sicily, and France, it was a mobile, aggressive, and adaptable war machine. Its men, imbued with their commander's offensive spirit, were trained to advance steadily, unstoppable in the face of obstacles or resistance. Its nickname, Old Blood and Guts, reflected both its approach to combat and its effect on its enemies. The race was on between the 1st SS advancing toward Bastogne and Patton's forces moving to intercept them. Both forces represented the best of their respective armies: ideological fanaticism and combat experience on the German side versus determination, logistical superiority, and flexibility on the American side. The clash between these titans, amid the relentless cold of the Belgian winter, would define not only the fate of the offensive, but possibly the ultimate course of the war in the West. As snow fell on the Ardennes, staff maps depicted a terrifying scenario: a massive bulge in the Allied lines that threatened to split them in two. The ensuing battle would not simply be a clash of weapons and tactics, but also of wills and systems. Time was running out for both sides. The Germans needed to reach the Meuse before Allied reinforcements closed the gap. The Americans needed to impede the enemy advance until their numerical and logistical superiority could manifest itself. With the fate of Western Europe at stake, the forces advanced through the snow toward an inevitable clash. The wrath of the 1st SS, snow, steel, and death in the Ardennes. Dawn on December 20th revealed a desolate landscape. Snow covered the Belgian fields and forests, transforming the Ardennes into a white desert where temperatures regularly dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Visibility was minimal. Thick fog mingled with vehicle smoke and gunfire, creating a ghostly atmosphere where the silhouettes of men and machines appeared and disappeared like specters. Panzer Division, advancing through this terrain, became increasingly difficult. The 68-ton Tiger II heavy tanks sank in the deep snow or slipped on the icy slopes. The narrow roads prevented deployments in wide formation, forcing columns to advance single file, vulnerable to ambushes. Even so, the division maintained a steady pace driven by German doctrine that prioritized speed and surprise. Kampfgruppe Peiper, having overcome initial American resistance, had advanced deep into Belgian territory in the first days of the offensive. His unit, composed of the division's best tanks and troops, was advancing west along the designated route. However, the other main column, Kampfgruppe Hansen, was heading south to secure the flank of the offensive and control the routes to Bastogne. At the same time, elements of the American 35th Infantry Division and 4th Armored Division were hastily deploying to block the German advance. The 35th, under General Paul Bade, established defensive positions on the Marvy, Lutrebois, Villers-la-Bonne-Eau line, while the vanguard of the 4th Armored Division advanced from the south to relieve them. On December 21st, Kampfgruppe Hansen moved towards Lutrebois, a small village controlling a strategic crossing. Under the command of SS officer Max Hansen, the unit included a lethal mix of armor, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and Jagdpanzer tank destroyers, mechanized infantry, and self-propelled artillery pieces. Fog had made Allied aerial reconnaissance impossible, allowing the Germans to advance undetected until they were practically over the American positions. The initial clash was violent and confusing. The American outposts in the woods north of Lutrebois were overwhelmed by the force of the German attack. The Panthers, taking advantage of their powerful 75mm gun and frontal armor, quickly destroyed several Shermans attempting to block the main road. The American infantry, inexperienced in fighting against SS Panzer units, were overwhelmed by the coordination between the German armored vehicles and grenadiers. By noon, Hansen had taken control of the northern half of Lutrebois. The Americans, however, dug in on the southern side, using the urban terrain to neutralize the German armored advantage. Every house became a fortress, every street a kill zone. German engineers attempted to clear buildings with explosive charges, while American tank destroyers waited in ambush in side alleys. Lieutenant Robert Jenkins of Company K, 134th Infantry, defended a crossroads for 5 hours with just 20 men and 2 anti-tank guns, repulsing 3 consecutive assaults. When they finally ran out of anti-tank ammunition, Jenkins ordered a retreat. Only 5 of his men managed to escape to the American lines. The situation at Longvilly, a few kilometers to the northeast, was equally desperate. There, elements of Kampfgruppe Piper, straying from their main route, clashed with units of the 35th Division and remnants of the 9th Armored Division. Tiger 2 tanks dominated the open country. Their 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away, while American 75mm shells barely made a dent in the German frontal armor. As the day progressed, the situation worsened for both sides. The snow began to fall more heavily, further reducing visibility. The extreme cold affected both men and machines. The cannons had to be fired regularly to prevent the mechanism from freezing. The wounded died quickly of hypothermia if not evacuated. Vehicle engines refused to start after stopping. Logistics became a critical issue, especially for the Germans. Cut off from their supply lines and advancing through hostile territory, the first SS units were beginning to suffer fuel and ammunition shortages. The technically superior German armored vehicles consumed more fuel than their American counterparts. This seemingly secondary factor would have strategic consequences in the days that followed. On December 22nd, Hansen launched a new attack to completely capture Lutrebois and advance toward Remoifosse, where he could cut the vital Bastogne-Arlon road. The assault began with an artillery barrage that virtually leveled what remained of the village. In the wake of the shellfire, Panzer Grenadiers advanced, supported by tanks. The American defense, organized around the remnants of the 137th Infantry Regiment, initially held, but the pressure was too much. In a desperate move, the American gunners lowered their barrels to horizontal level, firing directly at the German columns. This improvised tactic momentarily halted the advance, giving reinforcements from the 4th Armored Division time to organize a counterattack. Coordination between units became nearly impossible. The extreme cold affected radios. The fog impeded visual signals. Officers on both sides struggled not only against the enemy, but also against chaos and confusion. Entire platoons were isolated, not knowing whether nearby forces were friendly or enemy until the exchange of fire occurred. In this situation, training and experience made the difference. The veterans of the 1st SS, accustomed to operating in extreme conditions after years on the Russian front, were better able to maintain their cohesion and offensive capability. The Americans, for their part, demonstrated a flexibility and adaptability that surprised the Germans. The night of December 22nd brought a brief respite from the fighting, but no relief from the human suffering. Temperatures dropped further, while the wind drove the snow, creating blizzards that buried the wounded and hampered movement. Medics worked in impossible conditions. Their blood froze before it could stop the bleeding. Soldiers on both sides, too exhausted to continue, simply sat in the snow and fell asleep, never to wake up. Meanwhile, south of Bastogne, Patton's forces continued their incredible advance through the snowy terrain. The 4th Armored Division had marched nearly 200 kilometers in extreme winter conditions, an unprecedented logistical feat. Its forward units were already approaching the combat zone, preparing for the inevitable clash with the elite German forces. The battle for Lutrebois and Longvilly was turning into a race against time. Hansen had to capture these positions and advance toward the Bastogne-Arlon road before American reinforcements arrived. Every hour the defenders held out meant a shift in the balance of power. The morning of December 23rd began with even more intense cold. On the horizon, low clouds promised more snow. The battlefields around Lutrebois had become graveyards of twisted steel and frozen flesh. And through the mist, the first elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division began to deploy their forces, preparing for the decisive confrontation with Hitler's elite. Steel Titans, the final battle between Panzer and Sherman. Dawn on December 24th ushered in a faint greyish glow that barely penetrated the icy fog. For the first time in days, visibility improved slightly, allowing tank commanders to distinguish shapes beyond 50 meters. This atmospheric change, though modest, would radically transform the nature of the battle that was about to unfold. At 6:30 a.m., in this precarious light, the advance elements of Kampfgruppe Hansen began their movement from Lutrebois toward Remoifosse. Their objective was clear: to cut the vital Bastogne-Arlon highway and permanently isolate the besieged city. The German column advanced with Panthers, Ausf-G in the vanguard, followed by Panzer IVs, Jagdpanzers and half-tracks transporting grenadiers. Simultaneously, less than 2 kilometers away, units of the US 4th Armored Division were positioned in an improvised defensive line. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, had arranged his Shermans in hull-down positions, taking advantage of the rolling terrain. The M10 and M18 tank destroyers, with their 76mm and 90mm guns respectively, were camouflaged in the surrounding woods, creating a crossfire field. At 7:15 a.m., when the fog lifted momentarily, the two forces faced each other less than half a mile away. A tense silence dominated the field for endless seconds, as if time itself had frozen along with the landscape. The first shot came from a German Panther. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun found its mark on an exposed Sherman. The impact pierced the turret and caused the tank to erupt in a ball of fire. The American response was immediate and coordinated. 3 Shermans opened fire simultaneously on the firing Panther. 2 shells ricocheted off its frontal armor, but the third, fired from a side angle, pierced the side of the turret, detonating the stored ammunition. The American tankers had learned to adapt their tactics to the limitations of their vehicles. As Captain James Leach explained, "We operated in teams of 3 or 4 Shermans. While one attracted the attention of the German armored vehicle, the others maneuvered to attack its flanks or rear. We lost many good men learning this lesson, but once mastered, we could engage the best German tanks with some confidence." By 8:30 a.m., the fighting had intensified. A column of 5 Panthers attempted to flank the American position from the east, taking advantage of dense forest to conceal their movement. However, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, the fastest armored vehicles in the European theater at 55 miles per hour, 88 kilometers per hour on the road, intercepted them in a clearing. The M18's speed compensated for its weak armor, allowing it to fire and quickly change position. The result was devastating for the Germans. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Panthers were burning in the snow, their crews desperately trying to escape the burning compartments. The remaining 2 retreated to the protection of the forest, but one became stuck in a ditch hidden by the snow and had to be abandoned by its crew. The battle wasn't limited to main battle tanks. The entire range of armored vehicles participated in this deadly dance. The Jagdpanzer IVs, German tank destroyers with a low profile and a powerful 75mm gun, were especially effective in ambushes. Their turretless design, while limiting the field of fire, offered a low profile that was difficult to detect among vegetation and snow. Near Villers-la-Bonne-Eau, a platoon of 3 Jagdpanzers ambushed an American column, destroying 2 Shermans and an M3 half-track in quick succession. The American tanks could not locate the concealed firing positions until it was too late. This hit-and-go tactic significantly slowed the advance of the 4th Armored Division. At 9:30, the battle reached a new level of intensity with the arrival of aviation. Allied air control reported a brief period of clear skies, allowing the deployment of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. These fearsome aircraft, nicknamed Juggernaut by the Germans, could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs in addition to their 8 12.7mm machine guns. Their appearance provoked an immediate response from the Luftwaffe, which sent several Focke-Wulf FW-190 to try to protect the armored columns. The aerial duel contrasted dramatically with the ground battle. Fast-moving metallic silhouettes trailing condensation against the blue sky, while below, the heavy armored vehicles continued their slow, methodical combat. Allied numerical superiority prevailed. The P-47s descended like falcons, dropping bombs and firing their machine guns at the exposed German columns. The greatest impact of the air raids was not only material, but also psychological. The SS troops, accustomed to operating with air cover, or at least without direct opposition, were forced to disperse and seek shelter under trees. This fragmentation compromised unit cohesion and further slowed the advance. By midday, the battle was entering a critical phase. Hansen had lost nearly a third of his armored vehicles and fuel was beginning to run low. Company commanders reported tanks abandoned not due to combat damage, but due to a lack of fuel. However, the unit maintained its cohesion and discipline, reorganizing its forces for a new assault. The German counterattack began at 1:15 p.m., preceded by a brief but intense artillery barrage. The 88mm artillery shells of the SVK-18s launched shells that exploded in clouds of shrapnel over the American positions. Behind the barrage, 3 companies of Panzer Grenadiers advanced, supported by the remaining armored vehicles. The tactic was classic. The Grenadiers would clear the infantry positions while the tanks dealt with the armored threats. The SS soldiers, dressed in their distinctive white winter camouflage uniforms, advanced in waves, covering the ground with MG-42 machine gun fire, whose rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute had earned them the nickname Hitler's Sawtooth. The American response was equally coordinated. The 105mm artillery batteries fired constantly, creating a barrage of fire in front of the attackers. The 81mm mortars added precision to the volume of fire, concentrating on detected infantry concentrations. Meanwhile, the Shermans abandoned their defensive positions to counterattack, taking advantage of their greater mobility. At 2:45 p.m., the German advance began to lose momentum in the face of fierce resistance and mounting logistical problems. A staff officer from Kampfgruppe Hansen sent a desperate message to division headquarters: critical ammunition, insufficient fuel to reach current objective, requesting instructions. The reply, when it arrived 2 hours later, reflected the inflexible determination characteristic of the SS. Continue attack with all available means. Take the road at any price. No retreat. These orders, issued from a command center far removed from the reality of the front, condemned the attacking units to almost certain sacrifice. Yet the commanders on the ground carried them out with the fierce discipline that characterized the Leibstandarte. The result was a series of increasingly desperate attacks against the American positions. The German tanks advanced until they ran out of fuel, becoming static pillboxes from which they continued firing until their ammunition was exhausted. The Panzer Grenadiers, without adequate armored support, suffered devastating casualties trying to advance across open fields swept by machine gun and artillery fire. As night approached, the intensity of the fighting gradually diminished. The battlefield was littered with burning vehicles that cast a reddish glow across the snow. The wounded on both sides lay in the cold, their screams fading as hypothermia silenced them forever. The survivors, exhausted beyond human endurance, dug improvised positions or retreated to reorganize. The day's toll revealed the magnitude of the carnage. Kampfgruppe Hansen had lost more than 40 armored vehicles, almost half of its original strength. The Americans counted 27 Shermans destroyed, in addition to numerous support vehicles. The human toll was equally severe, with hundreds dead and wounded on both sides. But the strategic objective, the Bastogne-Arlon road, remained firmly in American hands. The 4th Armored Division had managed to halt the German advance, at least temporarily, and its forward units were already establishing contact with the besieged defenders of Bastogne. As night fell over the battlefield, commanders on both sides assessed the situation and planned the following day's movements. The technical armored battle had ended in a tactical draw, but time was on the American side. With each passing hour, more reinforcements arrived in the sector, gradually tipping the balance of military power. Among the smoldering wrecks of once mighty war machines, Hitler's elite had finally found an opponent willing and able to stand up to them. The tank duel in the snows of Belgium would continue at dawn, but the seeds of German defeat had already been sown in this bloody exchange of steel and fire. Patton's hammer: how the Third Army broke the Nazi elite. The dawn of December 24th, 1944, marked a radical change in the Battle of the Bulge. The fog that had protected the German advance for days began to dissipate, revealing a desolate landscape of destroyed vehicles, artillery craters, and frozen bodies half buried in the snow. For the first time since the start of the offensive, the clouds parted enough to allow large-scale air operations, condemning the German forces to constant exposure to Allied air power. Patton's Third Army had already executed its historic 90-degree turn, moving 3 full divisions north to attack the southern flank of the German salient. The 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of the advance, established contact with the besieged defenders of Bastogne on December 26th. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams managed to open a narrow corridor to the besieged city, allowing vital supplies to reach the 101st Airborne Division. Patton's strategy now focused on systematically destroying the German forces in the sector, beginning with Kampfgruppe Hansen, which continued to threaten the Bastogne-Arlon corridor from its positions at Lutrebois and Villers-la-Bonne-Eau. During the night of December 26th to 27th, more than 240 artillery pieces, including the powerful 155mm and 8-inch howitzers, were positioned to support the attack. At 5:30 a.m., this massive concentration of fire unleashed a saturation bombardment on the German positions at Lutrebois. The intensity was such that shells were falling at a rate of 10 per second in some areas. Trees were shattered into splinters that became additional shrapnel. After 30 minutes of bombardment, the American infantry advanced, supported by tanks. The 35th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of the 4th Armored Division, launched an encircling attack on Lutrebois. The Germans, stunned by the bombardment, offered a disjointed resistance. Even so, the SS Grenadiers fought with their characteristic fanatical determination, turning every house and cellar into a fortress to be taken at a cost of blood. Simultaneously, east of Bastogne, another American attack was developing against Kampfgruppe Hansen's positions at Villers-la-Bonne-Eau. Here, the 26th Yankee Infantry Division led the assault, again preceded by an intense artillery bombardment. Unlike at Lutrebois, where the buildings offered some protection, Villers-la-Bonne-Eau was completely leveled by the preparatory fire. When the American infantry entered what remained of the village, they found scenes of indescribable devastation: mutilated corpses, overturned vehicles, buildings reduced to smoking rubble. Despite massive casualties, the surviving elements of Kampfgruppe Hansen attempted a last organized stand. Max Hansen, the unit's commander, regrouped his remaining tanks, a mere 6 Panthers and 4 Jagdpanzers, for a desperate counterattack. On December 28th, this force launched itself against the American lines near Harlanger, attempting to break the closing encirclement. The attack was doomed from the start. The P-47 Thunderbolts detected the armored concentration almost immediately. A formation of 12 fighter bombers descended on the column, dropping 500-pound bombs and firing their 8 machine guns. In less than 10 minutes, 5 of the 10 German armored vehicles were burning like torches in the snow. Hansen himself was injured when his command vehicle took a direct hit. Witnesses last saw him trying to reorganize his men while bleeding profusely from a neck wound. His body was never recovered. With the virtual destruction of Kampfgruppe Hansen, the southern flank of the German salient was exposed. Patton wasted no time exploiting this advantage. On December 29th, he ordered a general advance across the sector, with the 4th Armored Division as the spearhead. American tanks advanced northward, methodically reducing pockets of German resistance. Interarms coordination reached levels of excellence during this phase of the battle. Fighter bombers acted as flying artillery, attacking enemy concentrations identified by forward observers. Artillery crews delivered counter-battery fire with devastating accuracy, silencing the German batteries. Combat engineers cleared paths through the snowy fields to allow the movement of heavy vehicles. For the 1st SS Panzer Division, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Its units, scattered across the sector, were losing operational cohesion. Communications, already compromised by the terrain and weather, became nearly impossible under constant Allied air pressure. North of the salient, the fate of the legendary Kampfgruppe Peiper illustrated the tragedy of the entire offensive. Joachim Peiper, one of the most aggressive commanders in the Waffen-SS, had penetrated deep into Allied territory during the first few days. By December 24th, his column was trapped at La Gleize, out of fuel, with limited ammunition, and surrounded by ever-increasing American forces. After several days of fierce fighting, Peiper made the difficult decision to abandon his vehicles and attempt to escape on foot with what men could follow. On the night of December 24th, some 800 survivors began a march through enemy lines. Most managed to return to German lines after a 20-kilometer trek through snowy forests and sub-zero temperatures, but Kampfgruppe Peiper, as an organized fighting force, had ceased to exist. The disconnect between the reality of the battlefield and the strategic fantasies of the Nazi high command condemned entire units to destruction. The 1st SS, disciplined to the bitter end, continued to launch impossible attacks against increasingly fortified American positions, consuming its last reserves in hopeless operations. On 1 January 1945, Hitler finally authorized a limited withdrawal, euphemistically presented as a rectification of the front. By then, the 1st SS Panzer Division had lost more than 60% of its original combat strength and almost all of its armor. The survivors began an orderly withdrawal to defensive positions around Houffalize. The retreat was carried out under constant aerial harassment. P-47 and P-51 fighter bombers patrolled incessantly, attacking any column they detected. German movements were restricted to night or occasional periods of bad weather. By January 8th, the German offensive had been completely neutralized. American forces methodically reconquered lost ground, liberating devastated villages and encountering scenes of unimaginable destruction. Residents who had remained in the area during the fighting emerged from cellars and dugouts, their eyes blank after weeks of continuous horror. On January 16, 1945, exactly 1 month after the start of the German offensive, the front had roughly returned to its original positions. The Ardennes were once again in Allied hands. Hitler's last major gamble in the West had failed miserably, consuming irreplaceable resources that would be desperately needed in the following months. Snow continued to fall on the abandoned battlefields, slowly covering the charred remains of what had once been mighty war machines. Silence gradually replaced the roar of cannon fire and the roar of engines. Only the wind howled through the shattered trees like a requiem for the thousands of men who would never return home. Frozen heroes, the invisible pain of battle. Beyond the strategic moves, tactical maneuvers, and historical analyses, the Battle of the Bulge was, above all, a human experience of extreme suffering and endurance. To truly understand what happened when the 1st SS faced Patton's elite, we must listen to the voices of those who lived through those hellish days. The cold emerges as the absolute protagonist in virtually every testimony, an enemy more lethal than bullets. Temperatures, which dropped to -28 degrees Celsius, created conditions that the human body could not endure for extended periods, especially in combat situations. Hypothermia and frostbite caused more casualties than enemy fire in many sectors. Soldiers on both sides succumbed silently during the night, unnoticed by their comrades until dawn. Sergeant James McLaughlin of the 137th Infantry Regiment wrote in his diary, "I lost feeling in my feet 3 days ago. The doctors say it's first-degree frostbite for now, but if I stay in the line, they'll soon be black and I'll lose them. Still, I refuse to be evacuated. My platoon is down to just 14 men out of the original 36. Many died not from enemy fire, but simply from freezing overnight." On the German side, Oberscharführer Heinrich Bauer of Kampfgruppe Hansen, captured on January 2nd, stated during his interrogation, "Our tanks became our worst enemy. The metal armor got so cold we couldn't touch it without our skin sticking to it. The engine oil froze overnight, forcing us to light fires under the tanks to warm them up before we could start. This, of course, made us perfect targets for American artillery. Hunger was another constant torment, especially for the German troops, whose supplies were compromised from the start of the offensive." A diary found in the pocket of an SS officer killed near Lutrebois contained this entry. "4th day without full rations. The men have started eating toothpaste mixed with snow to trick their stomachs. Yesterday we found a dead horse. It was frozen solid, but the men used hand grenades to tear it to pieces and eat the meat raw." The American soldiers, although generally better supplied, were not immune to hardship. Lieutenant William Harrison of the 35th Division recalled, "We spent Christmas Eve 1944 in a partially collapsed cellar on the outskirts of Lutrebois. Our Christmas feast consisted of frozen K rations, which we had to break up with rifle butts, and chocolate melted over a small fire, which we fed with pages from our pocket Bibles. The brutality of combat in such extreme conditions left deep psychological scars. The mental breakdown of elite German troops was particularly traumatic given their indoctrination. Trained in a military culture that glorified stoic endurance and heroic sacrifice, many SS men could not reconcile their ideals with the reality of impending defeat." An American intelligence report based on interrogations of Kampfgruppe Piper prisoners noted, "Notable levels of dissociation are evident among the higher-ranking SS prisoners. Several officers maintain the belief that the offensive has been a success despite their own capture. Others display extreme apathy, refusing to speak or respond to basic stimuli. The younger ones, especially recent recruits, appear relieved to have been captured. The tension between ideological fanaticism and the brutal reality of the battlefield provoked extreme reactions. Some SS officers executed their own men for attempting to surrender. In other cases, entire units disintegrated when the chain of command collapsed, with soldiers fleeing in different directions or simply sitting in the snow, awaiting capture or death. In contrast to the moral disintegration of the SS units, the American troops, though equally exhausted and traumatized, maintained a cohesion based on more horizontal and pragmatic ties. The shared experience of survival forged brotherhoods that transcended formal ranks and hierarchies. Sergeant David Morton of the 4th Armored Division reflected, "What kept us sane wasn't the big speeches about democracy or freedom. It was the guy next to you in the tank, the one who shared his last cigarette or woke you up when you fell asleep at your post. We fought for them, not for flags or generals." And I think that made the final difference with the Germans. When their vertical structure collapsed, they had nothing left. We always had the guy next to us. The 35th Infantry Division, which endured some of the heaviest fighting against the 1st SS at Lutrebois, developed extraordinary resilience. Originally considered a second-line unit, it emerged from the Ardennes with a reputation for formidable tenacity. For civilians caught in the combat zone, the experience was equally traumatic. Anna Schroeder, a resident of Lutrebois, recalled, "We spent 16 days in our basement. The cold was unbearable. We could hear the tanks passing over our heads, the screams of the wounded, the explosions that shook the foundations of the house. My 4-year-old son stopped talking completely. My mother died down there, probably of a heart attack, but we couldn't bury her until the Americans retook the village." The final human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was astronomical. The Americans suffered approximately 75,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. German losses are estimated at 80,000 to 100,000 men. Thousands of Belgian and Luxembourgish civilians died, and dozens of villages were completely destroyed. As Corporal Samuel Fuller of the 26th Infantry Division wrote in a letter to his family, "There is no victory here, only survival. Medals, promotions, mentions in the newspapers. None of that matters in this white hell. All that matters is seeing another sunrise, feeling your toes, remembering what the heat was like." These voices remind us that beneath the grand strategic moves and decisions of high command, war is always, ultimately, a deeply personal experience of human suffering. When the 1st SS and Patton's troops clashed in the snowy hills of Belgium, it was not just two military forces that collided, but two worldviews embodied by real men who endured conditions that defy modern understanding. Twilight of the Fanatics, the end of Hitler's division. By mid-January 1945, as the last shots of the Battle of the Bulge faded across the devastated forests, the strategic balance was unequivocal. The German offensive, conceived as the masterstroke that would reverse the course of the war, had failed completely. Far from halting the Allied advance toward Germany, it had accelerated the final collapse of the Third Reich by depleting its last strategic reserves. To understand why the offensive failed, we must analyze a combination of strategic, tactical, and logistical factors that, together, doomed the operation from its inception. The first fundamental error was underestimating the adversary. Hitler and his general staff presumed that the Americans, after months of continuous combat, would be incapable of responding effectively to a surprise attack. This assessment ignored the extraordinary resilience and adaptability of the American military, previously demonstrated in Africa, Sicily, and Italy. A German intelligence officer captured after the battle admitted, "We expected the Americans to become demoralized and retreat in disarray, as happened in 1940 with the French. Instead, even the surprised and surrounded units held resolutely, fighting us house to house, tree to tree." The second critical factor was the terrain and weather conditions. The Ardennes, with its dense forests, deep valleys, and few passable roads, proved much more restrictive than anticipated. The deep snow slowed all movements and multiplied fuel consumption. The extreme cold affected the mechanical reliability of the vehicles, especially the complex German heavy tanks. The third determining factor was German logistical inadequacy. The offensive was based on an optimistic assumption. that the advancing forces would quickly capture Allied fuel depots to maintain their momentum. When this didn't happen, the advance began to slow and eventually ground to a halt. The fourth factor, perhaps the most decisive, was the Allied response, both on the ground and in the air. The determination of units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and Patton's extraordinary maneuver demonstrated a tactical and operational flexibility the Germans could not match. When the weather cleared and allowed for large-scale air operations, Allied superiority in the skies became a devastating factor. The material toll of the offensive proved catastrophic for Germany. In total, they lost some 800 tanks and armored vehicles, 1,000 aircraft, and approximately 100,000 men who could not be replaced. For the Allies, although the losses were also considerable, they were perfectly acceptable given their vast industrial and demographic superiority. Every Sherman destroyed could be replaced in a matter of days. Every lost Panther or Tiger represented an irreparable gap in the dwindling German forces. For Germany, the defeat in the Ardennes marked the beginning of the end. With their strategic reserves exhausted and their best units decimated, they lost any chance of halting the Allied spring offensive. The operation, which Hitler had conceived as a decisive blow to change the course of the war, ended up hastening the final collapse of the Reich. The impact on morale was equally devastating. The German population, to whom official propaganda had promised imminent victory, had to face reality. The war was lost. For many officers and soldiers, even the most fanatical, the Ardennes represented the moment of truth. For the Americans, however, victory in the Ardennes had a galvanizing effect. A battle that began as a potential disaster ended as a triumph that strengthened confidence at all levels, from the high command to the rank and file. Sergeant Robert Brooks of the 4th Armored Division summed up the general feeling. After the Ardennes, we believed we could do anything. We had faced the best Hitler could throw at us under the worst conditions imaginable, and we had defeated them. The road to Berlin would be tough, but now we knew for sure we would get there. This increased confidence translated into a qualitative change in subsequent operations. The American divisions that had fought in the Ardennes displayed remarkable aggressiveness and determination in the following months during the final advance toward Germany. The battle also had lasting repercussions on collective memory and military historiography. For Americans, it became a symbol of resilience and adaptability, immortalizing moments such as General McAuliffe's response to the German demand for surrender at Bastogne. Nuts, roughly, don't even dream of it. For Germans, it represented the final act of a tragedy of Wagnerian proportions, the destruction of their elite forces in a desperate gamble. At the tactical level, the battle offered important lessons about mechanized warfare in winter conditions. The duel between the technically superior but logistically vulnerable German armored vehicles and the more reliable and numerous American Shermans foreshadowed debates that would continue into the Cold War about the optimal balance between quality and quantity. Patton's divisions also illustrated a fundamental contrast in military cultures. The Leibstandarte, with its iron discipline and fanatical loyalty, represented the paradigm of an ideologically motivated force. The American units, more pragmatic and flexible, exemplified a more modern approach to warfare. Professional without fanaticism, disciplined but adaptable. 70 years later, the Ardennes forests have healed their wounds. Trees have grown over ancient trenches. Streams flow peacefully where blood was once shed. But beneath the green blanket that covers the hills, the earth still holds bullet casings, shell fragments, and occasionally human remains. The American and German military cemeteries, with their neat rows of white crosses, offer a sober reminder of the human cost of that brutal winter. In small Belgian and Luxembourgish communities, monuments commemorate both the liberators and the civilians who perished. Perhaps the battle's most significant legacy is its reminder of how human determination can overcome the most adverse circumstances. When exhausted, hungry, and frozen soldiers pressed forward under enemy fire, when tank commanders maneuvered their damaged vehicles to protect their comrades, when medics operated by flashlight in freezing basements, when civilians shared their last supplies with wounded soldiers, in these moments a resilience was manifest that transcended flags and ideologies. An anonymous Leibstandarte soldier, interviewed in the 1960s, offered perhaps the most fitting epilogue. "We were considered the finest combat division in the Reich. We had fought from Poland to Russia, from Normandy to the Ardennes. We were convinced of our superiority, and then we encountered an enemy that not only matched us in determination, but surpassed us in capability. In those frozen forests, Adolf Hitler's Leibstandarte met its Waterloo, and with it, the dream of the Third Reich.